Martin Tabert was 22 years old when he ran out of money in Tallahassee, Florida, in December of 1921. He had left North Dakota to see the country, and somewhere along the way he boarded a train without paying for a ticket. A police sweep picked him up. A judge fined him $25 he did not have. His parents wired the money, plus enough for a ticket home, and none of it ever reached him. Instead, the sheriff of Leon County recorded him as available labor and leased him, along with dozens of other men, to the Putnam Lumber Company. The sheriff was paid a fixed sum for every convict he handed over. Tabert spent the following weeks standing waist-deep in Florida swamp water, cutting timber, developing a fever, and swelling in the feet until he could no longer keep pace with the work crew. When he fell behind, the camp's whipping boss propped him upright and beat him with a leather strap known as Black Ante until he collapsed. He died in his bunk hours later. This was not an accident of one cruel man in one bad camp. It was the predictable output of a system, one where a state government had the legal right to rent a living person to a private company, and where that company had every financial incentive to extract as much labor as possible before the man's body gave out. The price paid for Tabert was small. That was the point. A man who cost nothing to replace was a man nobody needed to keep alive. This was the arithmetic behind convict leasing, and it long predates the antebellum South. Somewhere in this story is a much older idea, that a condemned body is worth more as labor than as a corpse. And once a government makes that calculation, the only question left is which private buyer gets to collect. To understand how corporations came to lease human beings as forced labor in the American South, we have to go back much further than the Civil War, because the practice of renting out a condemned man's body did not begin in Georgia or Alabama. It began at the OAR of a warship. In ancient Rome, citizens sentenced to slavery for serious crimes were often sent to what were called ergastula, primitive holding facilities where unruly laborers were chained to workbenches and forced into hard labor, frequently for private landowners and contractors who needed cheap, disposable muscle. There was no unified prison system behind this practice. There did not need to be. A condemned man was simply reassigned from citizen to asset, and the state or the private party who received him owed him nothing beyond his next meal. This was punishment reimagined as an economic transaction, and it set a precedent that would outlive the Roman Empire by more than 1,000 years. By the early 1500s, a new version of the same idea took hold across Mediterranean Europe. Spain began the practice of sentencing condemned criminals to serve as oarsmen on naval galleys, a role that had previously been filled mostly by prisoners of war and men purchased for the purpose. As war captives became harder to source in sufficient numbers, the idea took hold that condemned criminals, men the state had already been executing by the thousands, represented an untapped resource. Instead, the practice spread quickly, showing up in France and the Netherlands by the 1520s, and later in Belgium and Austria. It reached its fullest and most systematic form under Louis XIV of France, whose Mediterranean fleet ran for generations on the labor of condemned men chained to the rowing benches of his galleys. A man convicted of theft or desertion, sometimes a debtor, sometimes a political prisoner, would be chained at the ankle to a bench alongside 4 or 5 other men, expected to row for hours at a stretch, under the eye of an overseer with a whip. There was no wage. There was no path back to ordinary life at the end of a sentence, because many sentences were effectively indefinite, extended at the convenience of the fleet's commanders whenever more oarsmen were needed. Disease spread easily in those conditions, chained bodies packed together for months at sea, and the death rate among galley convicts was severe enough that French naval administrators kept detailed replacement schedules, treating dead oarsmen as a logistics problem rather than a human one. Here is the detail worth sitting with. Christian France and the Ottoman Empire were, for most of this period, enemies. And yet, on opposite sides of the same sea, without any shared administration or coordination. Both civilizations arrived independently at the identical solution. Condemned criminals chained to oars, worked until they died, and replaced. When two hostile empires invent the same brutal shortcut without contact, it tells you the logic was not cultural, it was economic. A body that cost the state nothing to lose will always eventually be treated as expendable. The galley system finally faded, not because anyone decided condemned men deserved better treatment, but because naval technology changed. Sailing ships built for open ocean combat made oar-powered galleys increasingly obsolete by the middle of the 1700s, and European navies had less use for chained rowers. But the underlying idea that a convicted man's body was a transferable economic asset, rather than a person owed anything beyond his sentence, did not disappear with the galleys. It crossed the Atlantic. In 1718, the British Parliament passed the Transportation Act, formalizing a practice that had existed in smaller numbers since the 1610s. Convicted criminals in England, rather than being executed or jailed at the Crown's expense, would instead be shipped across the Atlantic and sold, their labor contracts auctioned off to planters and merchants in the American colonies. Over the following decades, somewhere between 30,000 and 60,000 convicts made this crossing, the overwhelming majority landing in Virginia and Maryland, where tobacco planters had a constant appetite for cheap labor. The mechanism played out openly on the docks of colonial American ports during this period. A ship's captain, who had transported the convicts at his own expense, would auction off each man's remaining years of service, typically 7 years for lesser offenses, 14 years or more for capital crimes that had been commuted to transportation. Buyers negotiated a price, usually between 10 and 20 pounds per convict, a price fixed not to the man's skill or health, but simply to the years of labor remaining on his sentence. Once purchased, the man belonged, for the length of that contract, entirely to whichever planter had placed the winning bid. Even Benjamin Franklin objected publicly to the practice, comparing England's export of convicted criminals to America as morally equivalent to America shipping its rattlesnakes back to England. The system did not end because colonial authorities regulated it out of existence. It ended because the American Revolution severed the shipping route in 1776, cutting off the supply overnight. The underlying economic logic, a fixed price attached to a convicted body, survived the war completely intact. It simply waited for its next American application, and it would not have to wait long. That application arrived after the Civil War, and it became the most industrialized version of this idea that had ever existed. The passage of the 13th Amendment in 1865 abolished slavery, with one deliberate exception written into its own text. Involuntary servitude remained fully legal as punishment for a crime whereof the party had been duly convicted. Southern state governments, faced with a devastated economy and a newly freed black population they were determined to control, read that exception as an instruction manual. Louisiana had already been leasing convicts as early as 1844, but after the war, the practice exploded across the entire South, expanding specifically to fill the labor gap left by emancipation and to reassert control over black communities through selective law enforcement and discriminatory sentencing. The scale of what followed is difficult to overstate. By 1898, convict leasing accounted for 73% of Alabama's entire annual state revenue. Companies leased convicted men for rates as low as $9 a month, occasionally lower. A figure historians have pointed out was cheaper than the cost of maintaining an enslaved person had ever been, because a leased convict represented no capital investment for the company holding him. If he died, the company owed nothing. The state simply sent another man in his place. Georgia's records from this era show a railroad company contracting for 100 workers at $25 each, and a later contract for the same number of men at $10 each. the price of a human being's labor falling year over year as the supply of newly convicted men kept growing. This is the price of a man laid completely bare, not a metaphor. An actual line item, negotiated downward across successive contracts, the way a business negotiates the price of coal or lumber. The physical reality of these camps matched the economics exactly. Men were housed in temporary camp facilities with no permanent quarters, shuffled between companies as contracts changed hands, sleeping in structures with no heat in winter and barely any running water. Shackles, the ball and chain, were standard equipment to prevent escape. Clothing was tattered. Shoes were treated as a privilege rather than a necessity. The Tennessee Coal, Iron, and Railroad Company, one of the original companies listed on the Dow Jones Industrial Average, was among the largest users of this labor. Its convict workforce expanding further once United States Steel acquired the company in the early 1900s. And it worked, in the narrowest sense, exactly as its architects intended. It rebuilt Southern infrastructure cheaply. It generated enormous state revenue. It kept newly freed black men under a form of control that closely mirrored the system that had just been legally abolished. But it failed the men caught inside it with a severity that eventually could not be hidden. And Martin Tabaird's death in 1922 became the case that made the failure impossible to ignore. What made his death different from the thousands of documented deaths that preceded it was not the brutality, which was common, but who he was. He was white, educated, and from a family in North Dakota, with the resources and the outrage to fight back. His parents' state attorney, Gudmundur Grimson, traveled to Florida to investigate and uncovered that Sheriff James Robert Jones had an arrangement with the Putnam Lumber Company, receiving payment for every man he could deliver, which gave him a direct financial incentive to arrest and convict people for minor or fabricated offenses. The New York World's coverage of the case won the Pulitzer Prize for Public Service in 1924, and by the middle of that year, more than 50 newspapers worldwide had reported on the flogging. A ballad about Tabaird's death was set to music and sung by Florida school children for years afterward. A black newspaper, the New York Age, put the injustice of this attention plainly at the time, noting that Tabaird's case, terrible as it was, could be matched and outmatched many times over by the deaths of thousands of black men who had suffered identically under convict leasing without any of them receiving a single headline. Under the weight of the publicity and worried about the effect on the state's tourism industry, Florida's Governor Kerry Hardy signed legislation banning the flogging of prisoners and formally outlawed the state's convict leasing system, with full abolition completed by 1923. Other southern states followed over the next several years, under similar pressure. Alabama held out longest, finally abolishing convict leasing on June 30th, 1928, the last state in the country to do so. But state-level bans on flogging and leasing were not, by themselves, what actually broke the economic engine driving this practice nationally. That required Congress. In 1929, lawmakers passed the Hawes-Cooper Act, which allowed individual states to refuse the sale of convict-made goods produced in other states, stripping those goods of protection once they crossed a state line. It was a partial fix, leaving each state free to decide for itself. The real turning point came in 1935 with the passage of the Ashurst-Sumner's Act, which made it a federal crime to knowingly transport convict-made goods across state lines at all. For the first time, the economic engine that had made convict leasing and industrial prison labor so profitable, the ability to sell cheaply made goods into a national market, was closed by federal law rather than by state discretion. It would be satisfying to end the story here. A scandal, a Pulitzer Prize, a moral awakening, and a law that fixed the problem. That is not quite what happened. The coalition that actually pushed the Ashurst-Sumner's Act through Congress was not primarily made up of civil rights reformers. It was manufacturers and organized labor, businesses, and unions who had spent years watching free workers lose contracts and wages to prison industries that paid nothing and could not strike. Their objection was economic self-interest dressed as reform, and it happened to align for a period with public outrage over cases like Tabart's. Once the interstate commerce loophole was closed, the industrial prison factories that had produced textiles and goods for national markets lost their financial reason to exist at that scale. What this reform did not do was end the underlying practice of extracting forced labor from convicted people for someone else's profit. Within a decade of these federal laws passing, Southern states had already replaced convict leasing almost entirely with chain gangs, prisoners still shackled together, still performing unpaid labor, just now on public road and construction projects instead of private company payrolls. The 13th Amendment's original exception clause, the same 9 words that had made convict leasing legal in the first place, was never touched by either Hawes Cooper or Ashurst-Sumner's. It remains in the Constitution today, unchanged since 1865, and the price of a man never actually left the ledger. It simply moved to a different column. A 2022 report from the American Civil Liberties Union found that incarcerated workers across the United States currently produce more than $2 billion a year in goods and over $9 billion a year in services, much of it for the maintenance of the very prisons holding them. Some states pay these workers nothing at all. Others pay a fraction of a dollar per hour. The Ashurst-Sumner's Act itself now carries so many exceptions: agricultural products, government use, certified partnership programs between private companies and prisons, that a meaningful amount of prison labor moves through interstate commerce again quite legally. So the honest answer to what regulation actually accomplished is narrower than it first appears. It did not end the practice of profiting from a captive body. It ended one specific, highly visible, highly profitable version of that practice, the one operating in full public view on southern lumber camps and railroad crews, the version that had become too politically embarrassing and too economically threatening to competing industries to survive. It moved the ledger indoors, and it has stayed there since. Consider a convict too weak to meet his work quota, standing in that same swamp. Under a system where his labor was not a private company's purchased asset, there would have been no whipping boss standing over him with a strap, because there would have been no financial incentive for anyone to extract more from his body than he had left to give. Martin Tabert would likely have simply served his sentence or paid his fine and gone home to North Dakota. Instead, his death became a news story precisely because it was rare for a case like his to be noticed at all, which is its own quiet indictment of everything that came before him. Thousands of men who looked less like Martin Tabert died the same way in the same camps, and history simply did not write their names down. If a company today were still permitted to negotiate a monthly rate for a human being's labor, the way Alabama once did with a railroad, what number do you think they would land on? And would knowing that number change how you think about what a regulated system is actually supposed to prevent? If you found this kind of history interesting, hitting subscribe would mean a lot.